They laughed at him. Not because he was weak, though in their eyes he was. Not because he was slow or soft or ignorant of the thousand sacred traditions woven into their empire's bones. No, they laughed because he dared to speak to them as if he were their equal, because he cracked jokes in the middle of sacred ceremony, because he stumbled on ancient customs with the audacity of someone who didn't care if he was trespassing, as long as he got to see what lay on the other side. They laughed because he was human, and in the Empire of Valkyria, humans were tolerated at best, decorative pets in the eyes of the nobility, intriguing perhaps, amusing occasionally, but never taken seriously, never powerful, never desired, until the king made the decree, until 3 sisters of the royal bloodline, the most feared, the most envied, the most untouchable, were bound to him in front of the whole empire, their fates sealed by law, older than their star-throned palace, until the laughter turned into something else. Chapter 1. The Man Who Spoke. During the silence. Jonas Reed wasn't supposed to be at court. He wasn't a diplomat or a soldier or a scholar fluent in the intricacies of Valkyrian protocol. He wasn't even a particularly good engineer, though he had jury-rigged a busted comms relay with nothing but a pressure glove and a bottle of whiskey. Mostly, he was just a talker, a fixer, a man who made things less tense when tensions were bound to explode, which is exactly why the Terran delegation had sent him to the Empire of Valkyria to observe a first-contact diplomatic initiative that was falling apart faster than anyone would admit. Jonas had a bad habit of getting involved when he wasn't supposed to, a worse habit of opening his mouth when every political instinct said he should stay silent. And now, standing in a vast throne hall that shimmered like the inside of a geode, surrounded by beings bred for dominance, bred to conquer, bred to see humans as nothing more than clever toys, he really should have kept his mouth shut. But when one of the alien princesses smirked and said, "Let the human speak, if only for the novelty of it," her voice laced with venom sweet enough to poison, Jonas smiled and spoke. There once was a prince, he said, to a hall full of confused, offended, and vaguely horrified aliens, who had everything: power, fear, beauty. But he couldn't make anyone laugh, not even his own heart. So he traveled the stars in search of something, someone, that might teach him what his world never had. There was a silence, long and sharp enough to cut through bone. Then the princess laughed. Not kindly. "You think a story will spare you, Terran?" she asked, and her sisters watched with folded arms, eyes like cold suns. "No," Jonas said, still smiling. "But maybe it'll make you curious." And that apparently was enough to trigger 6 layers of ancient lore he didn't know existed. Because by the time the king entered, by the time the edict was read aloud in a voice older than politics, it was already too late. By royal law, no daughter of the bloodline may invite a challenge and refuse the result. And if a challenge is made through parable, metaphor, or the telling of tale in a sacred place, and the tale is accepted, even in jest, then its outcome must be honored, and the outcome a human. Jonas Reed, bound by the law of kings to 3 sisters of the Valkyrian throne. Chapter 2. The Sisters and the Scandal. She can't be serious. High Princess Varrica stood like a blade given form, her obsidian armor reflecting the light of the palace's crystal walls. Her voice could command fleets, but right now, she sounded dangerously close to hysterical. Father invoked an antique relic of tradition, some backwater courtship law so old it might as well be from before the unification. Wars. No one's enforced it in 1,000 years. Across the chamber, her middle sister Zareen lounged on a cushioned plinth, idly toying with her braid, gold rings clinking against her sharp claws. "It's not the law that's the problem," she murmured. "It's the human." Varrica turned. her glare toward her sister. You laughed at him. I was being polite. You mocked him. In front of the court. I smiled. That doesn't count as consent. Zareen tilted her head. In Velkarian tradition it does. She's right, said the youngest, Lyra, who stood at the edge of the chamber, her pale skin catching the light like starlight over snow. He told a tale. You accepted it. That invokes intent. There was no intent. Lyra shrugged delicately. The law is older than intent, and older than reason, Varrica thought grimly. The worst part? The human didn't look like anything special, too lean, not enough muscle, no horns, no radiant aura of psionic discipline, no venom-slick talons, just a man, a human, smiling like he knew something the rest of them didn't. She hated that smile, hated how it made her wonder what else he knew. Chapter 3. Royal Decree. Jonas stood very still while the royal adjudicator read from the scroll. The hall was filled with a strange, thick silence, not hostile exactly, but heavy, watching, waiting. You have been claimed by tradition, the adjudicator intoned, and they by extension have been bound to you. Wait, what? Jonas blinked. You are now joined by decree of the royal throne in a sacred triad, as per the ancient bonds of challenge and consent. I thought I told a joke. Your humor was received, the adjudicator said solemnly. Thus, the pact is sealed. Hang on. They mocked me. I didn't mock them. Reversal of mockery in sacred space indicates invitation. An invitation, once acknowledged, becomes accord. Jonas stared. Oh my God, I got married by accident. The three sisters did not look amused. Chapter 4. Integration. Jonas's new quarters were luxurious, terrifying, and deeply uncomfortable. Not because of the architecture, though there were definitely too many sharp corners, but because of the company. 3 alien women, each more powerful than most entire governments, now legally tied to him, sleeping in the same palace, sharing his space, watching him, studying him. Varrica was the worst. She watched like she was waiting for him to explode, like he was some kind of ticking device wired to humiliate her. Zareen mostly just laughed and said deeply unsettling things like, how long do humans last during exertion? And would you die if I kissed you? And Lyra didn't speak much, but when she did, the words seemed to echo in his chest like vibrations through stone. You shouldn't be here, she said once softly, but I think that's why you are. He didn't understand that, not yet, but he had a feeling he would soon. The moment after the decree echoed through the crystalline court, everything stopped. You could have heard a microbe cough. The 3 sisters, once smug and aloof, now beautifully stunned, stood rigid as the murmurs of the royal court swelled into a chaotic crescendo. Alien nobles whispered behind elegant plumes of feathered armor. Advisors fumbled with holotablets, and military officers exchanged sharp, questioning glances. But all eyes kept sliding back to him. Darren Hayes, the only human on the planet Valerian 5, now legally married, by royal command, to 3 of the most powerful women in the Empire. He blinked once, then twice. Wait, what? He was sure he'd heard it wrong. His translator implant had glitched before. Maybe it was an idiom, a metaphor, a poetic alien tradition he'd misunderstood. But the king, a towering figure of violet crystal and obsidian muscle seated atop a throne grown from living stone, was already rising. Let it be done, he said with the gravity of a neutron star. The insult has been answered, the trial passed, and so, by law and by blood, you 3 shall now belong to the human you scorned. Princess Virex, the eldest sister, known for her ruthless command of the battle fleets, took a sharp step forward. Father, she said, voice laced with iron, surely this is not necessary. The king's gaze did not waver. He passed the binding gauntlet. No non-Veiler has ever survived it. and none of my daughters have ever lost to a challenger in its history. Darren winced. Technically, I didn't win. She tripped. You disarmed her and refused the final strike. You chose. Mercy, honor, and balance, all things our ancestors held sacred, the king replied. Besides, she tripped because you dodged. The nobles nodded, some in amusement, others in genuine admiration. The middle sister, Zalari, hissed under her breath. He's fragile, a soft worlder. This is insanity. And yet, the king said, the law is clear. Your mockery summoned the right. Your loss sealed the bond. You made this path, daughters. Now walk it. The youngest, Lissari, let out a faint laugh. Her sharp blue-gold eyes sparkled with something Darren couldn't read. Mischief, maybe. Maybe hunger. Well, she murmured, circling him like a predator. He's prettier up close. Darren began. You blush easily, she added, tracing the air near his face with one claw-tipped finger. He took an instinctive half-step back, only to bump directly into Virex's solid frame behind him. The eldest grunted, arms folded, expression stormy. The Royal Herald stepped forward. The ceremony will take place at moonrise. Preparations must be made. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the court exploded into motion. Darren was swept away by a swirl of attendants, cloth, censors, translators, and ceremonial jargon. Someone tried to fit him into something called a ritual spiral suit that looked more like a sentient curtain than clothing. He ducked and weaved his way past several over-enthusiastic tailors, escaping into a side corridor that hummed softly with pale green light. And there they were, the sisters, waiting for him. Virex leaned against the wall, arms crossed over her armored chest. Zalari was inspecting her talons with clear disdain, and Lissari was chewing something that looked suspiciously like bioluminescent gum. Darren froze. Okay, he said, hands up. Let's talk about this. You tricked us, Zalari snapped. How? Darren asked. I didn't even know I was in a marriage trial until someone shouted, let the bond begin. And the floor tried to eat me. You mocked our strength, Virex growled. I asked if your armor was supposed to creak that much. Exactly. Lysari chuckled. To be fair, he didn't intend to insult us. He's just naturally offensive. Darren took a deep breath. Look, I didn't mean to get into your honor system, or your royal laws, or your marital customs. I just wanted to negotiate trade agreements for the Earth Embassy. You could have said no, Virex said coldly. I did, Darren replied. At least 3 times. Lissari shrugged. Once the gauntlet is invoked, consent is implied, through survival. Darren blinked. You do realize how messed up that sounds? Zalari stepped forward, her eyes gleaming. Listen, human, we don't want this. You don't want this. So here's the deal. You show up at the ceremony. You say the words. We fake the rest. Publicly, we're bonded. Privately, we go our separate ways. You get your political alliance. We keep our dignity. Darren hesitated. That didn't sound terrible. But something inside him twisted. Would that actually help either of us? He asked. A fake bond, a fake marriage. Isn't the point of the law to force reconciliation? To build understanding from conflict? You sound like the king, Virex muttered. Lissari tilted her head. He has a point. Zalari rolled her eyes. Oh, please, don't tell me you're actually entertaining this. I'm not saying I'm thrilled about being bonded to a pink-skinned, soft-boned Terran, Lissari said with a smirk. But he did survive the trial, and he's oddly resilient. Darren sighed. Look, if we're stuck with this, can we at least try not to hate each other? Maybe even be civil. The silence was long, tense. Then Virex exhaled slowly. Fine, but you obey our customs, you follow our lead, and you do not try to kiss anyone. I wasn't planning to, Darren muttered. Good, she snapped, because I'd break your jaw. Zalari narrowed her eyes. He'd like that. I would not. Lissari was grinning. The tension hadn't disappeared, not even close. But it had changed. The ceremony was held beneath the twin moons of Valarian 5, in the crystal spire at the heart of the capital. Thousands watched from the upper terraces, while a choir of living stone sang in frequencies only the native-born could fully perceive. Darren stood between the three sisters on the ritual dais, glowing light running up his spine from the bond, sigils etched into the platform. Each sister placed a clawed hand over his heart, their own biosignatures syncing momentarily with his nervous system. He could feel their heartbeats, their energy, their emotions. Virex, pride and control, and something buried deep that hurt like an old scar. Zalari, calculation, suspicion, and fascination she tried hard to deny. Lissari, amusement, chaos, and a hint of dangerous longing. When the king spoke the final words, and the light around them flared like a nova, Darren felt something shift, not just in his body, but in the world. He was no longer just a diplomat. He was now their husband, and, if Valarian law was to be believed, the first human consort in the Empire's history. Later that night, in the royal wing of the palace, Darren found himself pacing the central chamber, an enormous space of glass and silver vines, filled with cushions, bioreactive lighting, and entirely too much anticipation. The sisters had retreated to their respective sanctums to prepare. He had no idea what that meant, and frankly, he was afraid to ask. Just as he was contemplating escaping through the nearest air vent, the door slid open, and the sisters entered, one by one, in ceremonial sleepwear that, to human standards, looked less like clothing and more like temptation given form. Virex was all sleek lines and silver-threaded armor silk, her posture radiating command even barefoot. Zalari's ensemble was sharp and jagged, woven from something that refracted light in ways that made her look both dangerous and absurdly alluring. Lissari had, predictably, chosen chaos. A one-shouldered gown that flowed like liquid shadow, her grin sharper than ever. "You're not running," Virex observed. "Yet," Zalari added. Darren swallowed. I figured that might insult someone." Lissari chuckled. "Smart husband." He winced. "Still getting used to that word. So are we," Virex said, stepping closer. "And let's be clear, human. This bond is public, political, ceremonial. Don't mistake it for affection." Darren nodded. "Understood." Zalari stepped beside her, eyes glinting. However, he echoed. "There is curiosity," Lissari whispered from behind him. Three voices, three gazes, three energies, all surrounding him now. The tension in the room was no longer just political, and Darren realized in that breathless moment that surviving this marriage might be even harder than the gauntlet, especially if he didn't want to survive it at all. Part 3. The Bound and the Burning. The ceremonial chamber had long emptied, but the air still held its weight. The throne room, now his by-law, was carved into the living stone of the Varnati citadel, its walls veined with faintly glowing silver threads that pulsed in rhythm with the planet's magnetic field. A symbol of power, of heritage, of immutable tradition. Ken stared out across the city through a crescent-shaped window of translucent obsidian. Down below, the capital of Zerak pulsed with ambient energy, a network of bio-circuited pathways and glowing towers that seemed to throb in time with his heartbeat. His world had changed with 4 words: "You shall marry him," and theirs had shattered. Behind him, the silence was heavy. 3 sisters, once proud and untouchable, now legally, cosmically, his wives. He could still feel the chill of those final moments in the arena of witnessing, still see the flicker of disbelief on their faces, still hear the stunned murmurs of the onlookers, as the old king, with his voice echoing like thunder against glass, invoked the royal claim, a law older than the stars overhead. He has bested the three in the trial of sovereignty, the monarch had declared, each word a brand upon the future. By right of combat, by will unbroken, and by the old accord of our house, he is owed the binding. The crowd hadn't cheered, they hadn't breathed, they had simply watched as the three sisters, icons of untouchable power, were turned from challengers into consorts. And now, in the aftermath, the chamber held only them. Three alien women, each a weapon forged by Varnathi tradition, each born into a caste of command, each standing as still as death behind him. Ken didn't turn. He wasn't sure if they'd kill him if he did. But he could feel their energies behind him. Crackling tension, emotional storms barely contained by armor and protocol. The air itself tasted of war and restraint, and somewhere beneath it all, the scent of ozone and the faint floral note of their homeworld clung to them like defiance. When he finally spoke, it was without turning. "You don't have to say anything," he said, voice level. "I know what you're thinking. I know how it looks." Silence. Then, finally, one voice, sharp as a blade. "Oh, do you, human?" That was Alira, the eldest, the commander. Her tone was ice over fire. "Do you understand what's been taken from us?" she continued, stepping forward. He could hear her armored boots clicking on the stone. "Do you understand what you've stolen with your cleverness?" He turned then, slowly, measured. Alira was standing only paces away now, tall and radiating fury. Her silver blue armor clung to her like a second skin, the ridges glowing faintly with her bioelectric charge. Her violet eyes were narrowed, her jaw tight, her fists clenched. "I didn't ask for this," Ken said calmly, holding her gaze. "I didn't want this law invoked. I would have walked away from that duel." "But you didn't," said the second voice, low and venomous. Celix, the middle sister, the tactician, the sharp mind and sharper tongue. She stepped out of the shadows on the left, her expression unreadable, the long braids of her dark hair coiled like serpents around her shoulders. "You stood in that arena, knowing what the trial meant. You challenged tradition itself. And now we are bound to you." Ken opened his mouth to respond, but the third voice, softer but no less cutting, slid in like silk over glass. "Were we trophies to you?" Naira asked. The youngest, sister, the empath, the voice between extremes. She stepped forward last, her presence less threatening but somehow more painful. Her eyes glistened with controlled pain, not rage, and that cut deeper than the others. "I saw your face when the king spoke," she said quietly. "You looked surprised, almost horrified. But now, you're still here." Ken took a breath. "I'm still here," he said, "because walking away would have made things worse. For you, for me, for your people," Alira scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself, Earthborn. I'm not. But I do understand politics. I know when a spectacle becomes sacred. If I'd refused the binding, the people would have seen it as rejection, of the trial, of your bloodline, and they would have punished you for it." Celix tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what of your punishment, human?" she asked. "Do you think us docile, that we'll fall into your arms like grateful brides?" "No," Ken said simply. "I think you're three of the most dangerous beings I've ever met, and I'm pretty sure I'll need to sleep with one eye open for a while." A beat. Then, unexpectedly, Naira laughed. It was a brief, bright thing, almost startled from her. Alira shot her a look, but Naira shrugged with one shoulder. He's not wrong. Ken didn't smile, but something flickered between them. A shift, a fracture in the ice. "I won the trial," he said, tone low. "But I'm not here to own you. I'm not here to chain you. I'm here because leaving would have made things worse. I stayed because now we have to find a way to navigate this together. Celix stepped closer now, eyes sharp and golden in the fading light. You think this is a diplomatic mission, don't you? Ken nodded. Yes, and a political one, and a cultural one, and a personal one. He paused. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to turn this mess into something better. Alira's nostrils flared. For who? Ken looked at each of them in turn. For all of us. That hung in the air, heavy, complicated, true. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then, finally, Alira turned away, her cloak whipping behind her, as she marched toward the side corridor. I'll have quarters prepared, she said coldly. One for each of us. Separate. Celix followed, her gaze lingering on Ken a moment longer. Don't mistake survival for affection, Earthborn, she warned. We may share a law, but not trust. Only Naira remained for a moment longer. She looked at him, really looked, before turning to go. At the threshold, she paused. I don't hate you, she said softly. Then she was gone. Ken was left alone in the throne room, the glow of the walls fading slowly around him. And all he could think about was the burning in his chest. Not fear, not guilt. Something more dangerous. Hope. The palace air felt heavier than it had the night before, not just with the press of humid heat or the resinous scent of the tree-born architecture that made up the high halls of Zorinthia's royal stronghold, but with the silent tension that clung to every corner of the chambers. Kai was being watched, not by the servants, who kept their heads lowered and their steps quick as they scurried about the morning preparations. Not by the guards, who did not so much as blink when the so-called royal husband passed, but by 3 sets of eyes, each glowing, in its own hue of judgment, curiosity, and something far more complicated. Nera watched from the shadowed balcony above the main hall, her long arms crossed and her silver-tipped fingers drumming against the carved obsidian railing. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture, the tension coiled in her shoulders, told a different story. The Sister of Blades was unused to ambiguity, and Kai's existence was nothing if not ambiguous. Across from her, lounging like a cat in sunlight on the edge of a suspended crystal dais, was Velix, the Sister of Storms. Her amusement was thinly veiled. She'd taken to teasing him the moment he emerged from his chamber. When he'd passed her on the terrace, she'd whispered, "Do earth males always snore so loudly? I thought a sand beast was mating with the walls." The sparkle in her eyes had lingered longer than the jab, and at the highest perch of all, seated on the narrow throne that overlooked the inner courtyard, was Sarika, the eldest, the fire, the one who had not spoken a single word to him since the ceremony. She hadn't needed to. Every glance from Sarika crackled like heat lightning under his skin. He didn't need to know their customs to understand. These 3 women were more than royalty. They were the Empire's sword, shield, and firebrand. Together, they had led fleets, quelled rebellions, and enforced the will of the Star Throne. Now they were his wives, and none of them had agreed to that arrangement. Kai ran a hand through his hair as he reached the lower training yard, exhaling slowly. The courtyard was wide and circular, framed by spiraling pillars of living crystal that pulsed faintly with the rhythm of the planet's heartbeat. A single sparring circle occupied its center. He needed to breathe, to move, to burn off the storm building inside him. Because the moment he opened his eyes this morning, he realized something had changed. He was no longer a guest. He was no longer merely the curiosity of a royal culture built on strength and hierarchy. He was bound to 3 warriors who now had a stake in him, whether they liked it or not, and there was no protocol for what came next. Training at dawn. Earthmen must lack proper dreams. The voice slid in like silk over a blade. Naira. She descended from the balcony like a shadow given form, her obsidian armor gleaming where sunlight struck it. Her white hair was braided tight along the curve of her scalp, and her eyes, those cold, gunmetal grey eyes, locked onto his with something like challenge. Kai didn't flinch. Sometimes dreams are more work than they're worth. Naira tilted her head. You've been bound to us for one day, and already you speak like a general. Maybe I'm adapting, or pretending. She stepped into the sparring circle with the fluid grace of a predator, one hand resting lightly on the curved hilt of the ceremonial blade strapped to her back. Kai followed her movements, letting his body settle into a looser stance. She was testing him. They all were, but Naira liked her tests up close and personal. You want to spar, he said, already knowing the answer. I want to understand the man we were given. She drew her blade with a hiss, the black steel catching the light and throwing it back as shimmering pulses. If I'm to be bound to a human, I intend to learn what he bleeds. Kai didn't reach for a weapon. He had none. Instead, he stepped forward, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in readiness. You won't need to make me bleed to understand me, Naira. She lunged, and the fight began. She moved like a storm given form, fast, sharp, merciless. Her first strike was a feint to his side, followed by a real slash aimed at his collarbone. He ducked under it, twisted, used her momentum to roll past her back. It wasn't an Earth-style sparring bout. There was no countdown, no formal salute. This was a fight for dominance. Naira didn't hold back, and he didn't ask her to. He pivoted, evaded, countered with quick feints and redirections, using the training he'd learned across a dozen planetary systems. But it wasn't strength that kept him alive in the ring with her. It was unpredictability. She hated that. Fight back, she growled, coming in again. Is this how you handled the Scourge during the Calyx Rift incident? By dancing around them like a coward? Her blade cut close enough to slice the air near his ear. Kai grinned, despite the sweat already running down his back. No, I made the Scourge argue with themselves. They fell apart in 3 days. Naira snarled, actual, visceral frustration. She pressed harder, strikes becoming faster, less controlled. She wanted to break him open, wanted to see what was underneath the jokes and the soft smiles and the calm. He gave it to her. When she overextended on her next slash, he stepped into her guard, pivoted, and slammed his shoulder into her center mass, sending her sprawling to the sand. Silence fell across the courtyard like a blade. Naira lay there, stunned, not hurt, not defeated, just surprised. Kai extended a hand. She stared at it. You don't have to like me, he said quietly. But I'm not your enemy, Naira. After a long moment, she took his hand. He pulled her up. She didn't let go immediately. Her fingers lingered against his palm, her breathing heavy, and for the briefest instant, her expression changed. Not softer, just less guarded. You're lucky I let you win, she said, stepping away. You're lucky I'm into terrifying women. With swords, she almost smiled. Almost. Later that day, Kai found himself in the central sanctum, the palace's soul, where decisions were made and history was written in the crystalline walls through psychic imprints of past rulers. He wasn't alone. Sarika stood at the heart of it, back to him, her long red cloak trailing behind her like fire. She didn't turn when he entered, but she'd known he was coming. I watched you with Naira, she said. You saw her try to kill me and then almost smile when she failed, Kai replied lightly. She doesn't smile. She's warming. Up to me. It's a slow burn. Sarika finally turned. There was no amusement in her face, only intensity, study, that same relentless scrutiny she'd given him the night before. You broke the law, she said. Kai blinked. Which one? You humiliated the royal court, defied our customs, and invoked the right of binding with nothing but wit and blind courage. That ceremony was meant to punish you, to make an example. Instead, her voice dropped lower. Now they whisper your name with curiosity, with fear. They don't know what to make of you. And you? Her gaze locked onto his like a heat-seeking weapon. I think you're dangerous in a way we've never accounted for. Kai took a step closer. And you're not sure if that's a threat or an opportunity. No, she admitted. He stopped just short of her, the silence crackling between them. I didn't ask for this, Sarika, he said, voice low. But I'm not leaving, and I'm not here to weaken you, or your sisters, or your empire. She studied him, then reached up and touched his chest, right over his heart. You speak like someone with nothing to lose. Kai swallowed. Maybe. I've never had something worth losing. That changed something. In the air. In her stance. In the way her hand didn't move for a moment too long. Then she turned away. Dinner is in 2 hours. You will sit beside us. Wear something that doesn't smell like sand and sweat. Should I assume there's a dress code? Yes. Don't embarrass me. She vanished through the side corridor, but he swore, just before the door closed, he saw the ghost of a smile tug at her mouth. Just for a second. That night, as the twin moons of Zorinthia cast pale gold and silver light through the latticework of the palace towers, Kai found himself seated at the royal table, between 3 women who had once mocked him. Now bound to him. None of them spoke, for the first half of the meal, but none of them left either. Naira sat to his right, hands clasped with military precision, her posture perfect, her expression neutral, but she did not correct him when his elbow brushed hers. She did not flinch when he passed her the ceremonial wine. Velix reclined on his left, eyes dancing with curiosity and mischief. She offered commentary on each course in a language Kai didn't know, and he suspected most of it was inappropriate. But she didn't leave his side, not even once. And Sarika watched him from across the table, like she was still trying to solve a puzzle that had begun to rearrange her, even as she tried to control it. There was power here, tension, danger, but there was also something else now, the beginnings of possibility, of something no royal decree could command or create, not submission, not fear, but connection. Kai lifted his glass. To surprises, he said, watching all 3 women. Naira didn't raise hers, but she nodded. Velix raised hers with a smirk. To chaos. Sarika held her glass for a long moment, then lifted it. To the man no one expected, she said quietly. And to what comes next. They drank, and the tension didn't disappear. It deepened, warmed, shifted into something that was starting to feel inevitable. Part 5. Boundaries and Breaches. The royal palace of Velkaria was a labyrinth of crystalline corridors, each pulsating with ambient light that responded to the emotional undercurrents of its inhabitants. Tonight, the halls glowed with a subdued indigo hue, mirroring the simmering tensions that had become the norm since the binding ceremony. Ethan found himself wandering these corridors, seeking solace from the weight of his new reality. The air was thick with unspoken desires and unresolved conflicts, each step echoing the complexity of his entanglement with the 3 alien sisters. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter. Turning a corner, Ethan nearly collided with Lyra, the youngest of the trio. Her luminescent eyes widened in surprise before narrowing with a mix of curiosity and something more elusive. "Couldn't sleep?" she inquired, her voice a melodic whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan offered a wry smile. "Seems the palace has a way of keeping one restless." Lyra tilted her head, studying him intently. "Perhaps it's not the palace, but its occupants that stir your unrest." The air between them grew charged, the unspoken tension palpable. Ethan cleared his throat, attempting to dispel the mounting heat. "Care for a walk? Maybe a change of scenery?" Will help. She hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. Lead the way. As they meandered through the moonlit gardens, the conversation flowed more freely. They spoke of their worlds, their cultures, and the burdens of expectation. With each shared story, the chasm between their species seemed to narrow, replaced by a bridge of mutual understanding. Chapter 2. The Dance of Dominance. The following morning, Ethan was summoned to the training arena, a vast expanse where warriors honed their skills. Awaiting him were Varrica and Zareen, their expressions unreadable. "You've shown resilience," Varrica began, her tone devoid of its usual frost. "But words and wit only go so far. Let's see how you fare in combat." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Is this another test?" Zareen smirked, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Consider it an exploration of boundaries." Weapons were offered, but Ethan declined, opting instead for hand-to-hand combat. The sisters exchanged a glance before nodding in agreement. The sparring was intense, a blur of movement, feints, and counters. Ethan held his own, his Terran training evident. But the sisters were formidable, their synergy nearly overwhelming. As the session progressed, the line between combat and something more blurred. Touches lingered longer than necessary, breaths intermingled, and the charged energy became undeniable. A misstep led to Ethan pinning Zareen beneath him, their faces mere inches apart. Her eyes searched his, a storm of emotions swirling within. "You're full of surprises, human," she murmured, her voice husky. Before he could respond, Varrica's hand clasped his shoulder, pulling him back. The moment shattered, leaving all three grappling with the implications. Chapter 3. Forbidden Desires. Days turned into weeks, and the intricate dance of dominance and submission continued. The boundaries set by duty and tradition became increasingly difficult to uphold. One evening, Ethan found himself alone with Varrica in the strategy chamber. Maps and holograms illuminated their faces, but the real battle was the one waging between their gazes. "You challenge me," she admitted, breaking the silence in ways no one else dares. Ethan stepped closer, the space between them charged. "Perhaps it's because I see the woman behind the warrior." Her breath hitched, but she held her ground. "This is dangerous." Sometimes the most worthwhile things are. The distance closed, and, for a fleeting moment, the universe held its breath. But before the dam could break, Varrica turned away. "We can't," she whispered. "Not yet," Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll wait." Chapter 4. Unraveling Threads. The political landscape grew tumultuous. Factions within the Empire viewed Ethan's presence as a threat to tradition, their whispers growing louder. During a council meeting, an elder voiced the sentiment: "A human consort disrupts the balance. It's an affront to our ways." Lyra rose, her voice unwavering. "The binding was decreed by the king. To question it is to question the throne." The chamber fell silent, the challenge clear. Later, in the privacy of their quarters, Ethan confronted Lyra. "You didn't have to defend me." She met his gaze, vulnerability flickering across her features. "Yes, I did. Because despite everything, I believe in us." The confession hung between them, a delicate thread weaving their fates tighter. Chapter 5. The Edge of Surrender. The nights grew longer, filled with stolen glances, accidental touches, and dreams that left Ethan yearning. One such night, he stood on the balcony, the cool air doing little to quell the fire within. Footsteps approached, and he turned to find Zareen. "Can't sleep?" she inquired, echoing Lyra's words from weeks prior. "Seems to be a pattern," he replied, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. She stepped closer, the space between them electric. "Ethan, this tension, it's consuming me." He swallowed hard. You're not alone in that. Her hand reached out, tracing the line of his jaw. Then let's stop fighting it. Their lips met, a collision of pent-up desire and forbidden longing. The world melted away, leaving only the two of them, but reality was a cruel mistress. Pulling back, Zareen's eyes brimmed with conflict. We can't. Not like this. Ethan nodded, the ache in his chest echoing hers. I know. Chapter 6. The breaking point. The facade was crumbling. The weight of duty, desire, and deception bore down on them all. During a royal banquet, tensions reached a crescendo. A visiting dignitary made a lewd comment about Ethan's role, eliciting laughter from some. Before Ethan could respond, Varrica stood, her presence commanding silence. Insult him again, and you'll answer to me. The hall held its breath. Ethan touched her arm gently. Varrica, it's okay. No, it's not, she countered, her voice softening only for him. You are ours, and we protect what's ours. The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembly. Chapter 7. Fractured Loyalties. The sisters convened in private, the air thick with unspoken words. We're losing ourselves, Lyra began, her voice trembling. This bond, it's changing everything. Zareen paced, frustration evident. I can't deny what I feel, but acting on it could unravel the Empire. Varrica remained silent, her internal battle evident. Ethan entered, sensing the gravity of the moment. Then let's redefine Part 6. The king's shadow and the warrior's glare, the night after the ceremony, was far from restful. The royal chambers were darkened, lit only by the soft bioluminescence that pulsed along the carved walls of the palace, veins of light that seemed to beat in time with something older than memory. Taran stood shirtless near the wide arched window, the silk belt of his ceremonial robe undone, hanging useless at his hips. He wasn't cold. The air on Vela Prime was warm, humid, fragrant with the pollen of night-blooming plants that only opened their petals under moonlight. Behind him, the bed was large enough for 3, or more, but remained untouched. He hadn't slept, not with the weight of what had just happened, not with what was coming. Outside, the wind carried with it the low thrum of distant drums. Tribal celebrations, Valarian traditions honoring mating rites and royal decrees. He could see the silhouettes of dancers around the temple fires on the lower levels, alien bodies in fluid motion, armor traded for silk, weapon hands wrapped in garlands. The people had embraced the decree, the law, the union, but not the sisters. Not yet. The door behind him slid open soundlessly, a whisper of engineered air and softened hinges. He didn't need to turn. He knew the sound of Kashara's footsteps. She moved like a storm in disguise, barely restrained, full of force and direction. When she entered a room, the air changed. The temperature shifted. You could feel her before you saw her. Tonight, she wore black. Not armor, something looser. A silken wrap that bared one shoulder, revealing the powerful lines of her toned upper body and the violet shimmer of her skin in the low light. Her hair was tied back, warrior style. Her stance was still tight, like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. You didn't come to the hall, she said. No greeting, no preamble. No, Taran answered simply, still staring out the window. Didn't feel like pretending. You're king now, she said. Her tone was unreadable. Everything is pretending. He turned slowly, just enough to see her fully. Her eyes were sharp, cold, but there was something else flickering behind them tonight. A tension he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not hatred, uncertainty. They still resent me, he said. You, this. Kashara folded her arms. They'll get over it, will you? Her eyes narrowed. Her silence was louder than any answer. Taran took a step toward her, the silk of his robe whispering against his skin. The palace walls responded subtly, sensing the increase in bioelectric tension. A low hum began to build in the floor. Kashara didn't move. I didn't choose this, he said, voice low. The law was clear. The king of Velar must bind with the daughters of House Threx. I didn't make that law. Your ancestors did. I just followed it, she snorted, a sound halfway between amusement and disbelief. You think quoting our laws makes you worthy of us? No, he said, stepping closer. But I think defying them makes you less worthy of yourselves. That struck a nerve. She moved before he finished speaking. Fast, fluid, a step forward that closed the space between them like a lash of lightning. Her hand went to his chest, not as a caress but a shove. Not hard enough to knock him back, but enough to remind him what she could do. What do you want from us? She demanded, her voice sharp, but laced with something breathier beneath it. Obedience, submission, gratitude. Taran didn't flinch. He met her glare with quiet force. I want you to stop pretending you hate me. Silence. Then, I don't hate you, she said finally, her voice barely audible. But I don't trust you. That's fair, he said. But it's not the same as hate. Her hand was still against his chest. His heart beat steady, beneath it. And what about what you want from me? She asked, her voice softer now. From us? He stepped into her palm, their bodies almost touching now. The charged air between them crackled like live wire. I want something real, he said. Not obedience, not performance, not a ceremonial union with women who want to see me dead. I want you, as you are. Not as a queen, not as a symbol, just you. Kashara's breath caught. The light in the room pulsed. I don't belong to anyone, she whispered. No, he agreed. But maybe you don't have to be alone either. Something shifted in her face then. A subtle softening of her jaw, the flicker of doubt giving way to something deeper. Her hand slid down from his chest to his waist, fingers brushing the loose sash of his robe. Taran, she murmured. His name, the first time she'd said it like that, not with contempt, but with warning. Or maybe longing. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But they stood there, impossibly close, bound by more than the law, by something unspoken, something dangerous. And it was only beginning. Chapter 2. The Air of Blood and Fire. The throne hall was different when you sat on the throne. Taran never liked this room. Too vast, too open, too ceremonial. A place where power was displayed, not wielded. But now, seated in the high-backed obsidian chair, he felt the full pressure of it. Every pair of eyes in the chamber was watching him, measuring him, waiting for him to fail. The three sisters were present, each in her designated place. Kashara stood at his right, still the symbol of Threx military dominance. Her stance was guarded, but she hadn't tried to kill him this morning, which was probably progress. To his left stood Solari, the middle sister, adorned in white and gold, the mark of the royal mind scholars. Her expression was unreadable, as always, but her posture had changed. She was watching Taran more closely these days, studying him. She had begun asking questions in private council, not because she needed answers, but because she wanted to understand the way he answered. Behind them stood the youngest, Valessa, half hidden in the shadow of a stone pillar, pretending she wasn't listening to everything. Her hair was wild as always, a crown of emerald coils falling over her shoulders. She was dangerous in a different way. Unpredictable, curious, prone to moments of sharp rebellion, followed by disarmingly playful affection. Three sisters, three different kinds of threat, three different kinds of temptation, and all of them bound to him now. The tension was always thick when they were together. Not overt hostility, not anymore, but something knotted and volatile, like thunderclouds stacked atop each other, waiting for a strike. He liked it better that way. A people that no longer feared you were dangerous, but a people that underestimated you. That was a mistake. My lord, the herald interrupted the silence, voice echoing across the polished stone. The council has reviewed the petition from the High House of Dirax. They seek permission to bypass border tariffs in exchange for an increased resource. Tithe. Taran didn't look at the herald. His eyes were on Solari. Well? He asked her directly. What do you think? There was a subtle ripple of reaction in the room, a king asking a queen's opinion before his own. But Solari didn't flinch. She stepped forward, graceful as flowing water. They seek to establish a precedent that weakens your authority, she said calmly. Their tithe increase is a feint. The numbers don't match the risk. You would lose face. Then the answer is no. He turned his attention back to the court. Let it be recorded. The petition is denied. Another ripple. Solari inclined, her head slightly, and for a brief second, he caught the edge of something on her lips. Approval? Respect? Amusement? Maybe all three. The court moved on, but the power balance had shifted again. Taran wasn't just sitting the throne. He was starting to wear it, and the sisters, slowly, reluctantly, were beginning to feel it too. Chapter 3. The Youngest, Flame. Later that night, he found Valessa in the Sky Garden, barefoot as always, her feet on the mossy platform that floated above the palace spire, dancing, alone in the night. She didn't stop when he arrived, didn't even look at him. Valessa, he said softly. She spun, her dress catching the wind, her body turning like a flicker of light in motion. Her movements were alien, mesmerizing. Not a human dance, not choreographed, just instinct, flow, fire. You're supposed to be in bed, she said, twirling past him. Or with your wives, or with your advisors, or maybe all three. You're one of those wives, he said. She stopped, looked at him. And yet you don't come to my room. You never invited me. Valessa tilted her head. Would you come if I did? Try me. The challenge hung in the air between them. She stepped forward, her eyes aglow with the light of the twin moons. Her skin was like burnished gold, and her expression was mischievous. But beneath it, something more. Dangerous stirred. I bite, Taran. So do I. Their lips almost touched, but not yet. Valessa laughed. You humans, she whispered, brushing past him. So predictable. So honest. He turned to follow her gaze. She was looking down at the city, the towers glowing in concentric rings of emerald and silver. Is that bad? He asked. No, she said. It's strange. A beat passed. Then, I'm going to kiss you, she said suddenly. He didn't move. She leaned in, kissed him, quick, fierce, and unexpectedly gentle. Then she stepped back. For balance, she said, and vanished into the night garden, laughter echoing like wind chimes in the breeze. Taran stood there for a long moment and smiled. This wasn't how he expected royal marriage to go, but he wasn't complaining, not even a little. Part 7. Shadows of Desire. The palace corridors were a maze of shadows and light, the bioluminescent flora casting intricate patterns on the crystalline walls. Ethan navigated the labyrinthine halls, his mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. The binding ceremony had set into motion a series of events that neither he nor the sisters could have anticipated. Chapter 1. The Unseen Watcher. Late into the night, Ethan found solace in the palace's grand library, a vast repository of knowledge from countless worlds. Shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceilings, filled with tomes and holographic interfaces. He immersed himself in Valkyrian history, seeking understanding of the culture he was now entwined with. Unbeknownst to him, he was not alone. From the shadows, Lyra observed him, her presence concealed by the dim lighting. She had always been the most enigmatic of the sisters, her emotions a carefully guarded secret. Yet, as she watched Ethan's brow furrow in concentration, a pang of something unfamiliar tugged at her heart. She stepped forward, allowing her footsteps to announce her presence. Ethan looked up, surprise flickering across his features before he offered a warm smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, echoing the question she had posed to him weeks earlier. Lyra's lips curved slightly. "It seems the palace has that effect on its inhabitants." He gestured to the seat beside him. "Care to join me? I'm trying to decipher the intricacies of Valkyrian politics." She hesitated before gracefully taking the offered seat. "Our politics are as complex as the stars themselves. What do you wish to know?" Their conversation flowed, touching upon history, governance, and philosophy. As the hours passed, the initial formality between them dissolved, replaced by genuine curiosity and mutual respect. A comfortable silence settled, broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the ambient hum of the library's energy conduits. Lyra found herself stealing glances at Ethan, noting the way the soft light highlighted his features, the intensity in his eyes as he absorbed the information. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Lyra withdrew her hand quickly, a rare flush coloring her cheeks. "Apologies," she murmured. Ethan shook his head, his gaze locking onto hers. "No need to apologize." The air between them grew, thick with unspoken words, the weight of their shared circumstances pressing down upon them. Before either could break the tension, a distant chime echoed through the halls, signaling the approaching dawn. Lyra rose gracefully. "I should retire. The council convenes at first light." Ethan stood as well, nodding. "Of course. Thank you for the enlightening conversation." She paused at the doorway, glancing back at him. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion another time." "I'd like that," he replied, sincerity evident in his tone. As she disappeared into the shadows, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the night's encounter had shifted something fundamental between them. Chapter 2. The Dance of Flames, the Annual. Festival of Luminescence was a celebration like no other, a night where the Valkyrian skies were set ablaze with bioluminescent displays and the palace transformed into a realm of light and music. Ethan stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, observing the swirling dancers. The Valkyrian attire was a spectacle in itself, garments woven with threads that shimmered and shifted colors with every movement. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Zareen, her usual armor replaced with a flowing gown that mirrored the hues of a sunset. The transformation was breathtaking. "Enjoying the festivities?" she inquired, a playful glint in her eyes. "It's mesmerizing," Ethan admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." Zareen extended her hand, a challenge in her gaze. "Care to dance?" He hesitated. "I'm not familiar with Valkyrian dances. I wouldn't want to embarrass you." She laughed softly. "Consider this a lesson then." Taking her hand, Ethan allowed himself to be led onto the dance floor. The music was unlike anything he'd heard, rhythmic yet fluid, with melodies that seemed to intertwine like vines. Zareen guided him through the steps, her movements a seamless blend of grace and strength. As they danced, the space between them diminished, their bodies moving in synchrony. The world around them faded, leaving only the two of them, connected by the rhythm and the growing tension that neither could ignore. As the final notes of the song lingered in the air, they found themselves standing close, breaths mingling. The urge to close the distance, to bridge the gap between duty and desire, was overwhelming. But before either could act, a voice broke through the haze. "Mind if I cut in?" They turned to see Varika, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Zareen stepped back, a mixture of relief and disappointment flashing across her face. "He's all yours," she said, her tone light, but her eyes betraying deeper emotions. Varika took Ethan's hand, leading him into another dance. As they moved, she leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. "Be careful, Ethan," she whispered. "The flames you kindle may consume you." He met her gaze, searching for meaning in her words, but found only mystery. Chapter 3. The Storm's Eye. The political climate within the palace was shifting. Factions formed and dissolved, alliances were tested, and Ethan found himself at the center of a web he was only beginning to understand. One evening, as a storm raged outside, he sought refuge in the observatory, a circular chamber with a domed ceiling that offered a panoramic view of the tumultuous skies. He wasn't alone. Varrica stood by the expansive window, her silhouette illuminated by flashes of lightning. She turned as he entered, her expression contemplative. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, a hint of a smile on his lips. She chuckled softly. "It seems insomnia is contagious." He joined her by the window, the two of them watching the dance of lightning across the horizon. "Storms on Valkyria are fierce," Ethan remarked. "They mirror our spirits," Varrica replied. "Wild, untamed, and unpredictable." A comfortable silence settled between them, the tension from the festival lingering but unspoken. After a while, Varrica broke the silence. "Do you regret it, being bound to us?" Ethan considered her question carefully. "Regret implies wishing for a different path. While this journey has been unexpected, I can't say I regret it." She nodded, absorbing his words. "You are different from anyone we've ever known, Ethan. You challenge us, make us question ourselves." He turned to face her, the intensity of his gaze matching the storm outside. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of thunder. "But it's terrifying." The air between them cracked. The ceremony chamber pulsed with light and tension. Crystalline banners hung like frozen thunder above the crowd of assembled nobles, warriors, and foreign dignitaries, all gathered to witness something the Valari had never seen in the thousand cycles of their empire. A human, draped in ceremonial silver and obsidian, standing at the center of the grand spire with 3 alien women, royal-born warriors once bound only to the throne, now bound to him. By ancient decree, yes, but the truth had long outgrown the law. Kyle stood tall, his earthborn features stark among the sea of alien beauty. The trio at his side, Talis, the strategist, cloaked in white fire, Nyari, the fighter, armored and radiant, and Visa, the siren diplomat, shimmering with silken secrets, were no longer simply heirs to a throne. They were his wives by law, his allies by battle, and something far deeper by desire. They were his future, and the world was watching. "Kyle of Earth," the High Seer intoned, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Do you accept the burden of the Flame Crown, to guide the Valari not as a stranger, but as bloodbound, bonded to our royal triad, by sacred flame and shared oath?" Kale's gaze slid to each of his wives. Talis met his eyes with a fierce, unflinching stare, one that had once sought to break him, now glowing with loyalty. Nyari smirked, half defiant even in reverence, daring him to say no. And Viesa's smile was the slow curve of danger, seduction, and pride all in one. He looked forward, his voice steady. "I do." The flame crown descended, a halo of living crystal and fire, formed from the molten core of Vela itself. As it settled onto Kyle's head, the crowd erupted in a chorus of war cries, oath chants, and ululating song. But the pressure in Kyle's chest wasn't from the ceremonial weight. It was from the fact that, with this act, he had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited a civilization steeped in old power, built on trial and violence, and now they expected him, a human once mocked for his fragility, to lead not by mimicry, but by transformation. He was no longer an outsider. He was now the axis on which the empire would turn. Hours later, behind the privacy seals of the royal chambers, the real storm began to unfold. Kyle barely had time to remove the ceremonial gloves before Nyari shoved him backward onto the nearest velvet-lined seat with the same force she'd once used to pin him in the arena. "You accepted." "The crown," she growled, straddling him with slow, deliberate pressure. "Now we're going to see if you can wear it without falling apart." Her kiss was punishing, molten, but it wasn't anger. It was something else, something hungry, wild, and reverent. Talis entered behind her, silent but sharp-eyed, already, undoing the laces of her own gown. "You've made us yours by law, Kyle. But now—" She slid closer, her fingers dragging across his exposed chest. "We make you ours." And Visa, trailing behind in a gown that shimmered like mist and shadows, simply smiled as she locked the chamber doors with a wave of her hand. "3 queens," she whispered, "1 king, and a night that none of us will forget." Kale's breath caught as the 3 of them moved in concert. Nyari's heat, Talis's precision, Visa's tease, all coordinated like a dance he'd only barely learned the steps to. "You realize," he managed as Nyari kissed down his throat, "this probably isn't in the diplomatic manual." Visa laughed softly, curling herself around his side. "It will be after tonight." Hours became moments. Moments became eternity. He didn't remember falling asleep, only the warmth of their bodies wrapped around his, their breathing slow and matched, their bond somehow deeper than skin, deeper than blood. When he awoke, the 3 of them were still wrapped around him, each in a different position, each in a different rhythm, but all with their energy synced to his own, and he felt it. Not just love, not just lust, but alignment. Valari tradition had brought them together, but something else had made them unbreakable. The morning came with fire in its belly, not from his wives, who lay still sleeping, their skin aglow with shared aftermath, but from the emergency transmission blinking red against the chamber wall. Kyle disentangled himself with reluctant care and crossed to the console, expecting the usual post-coronation chaos. Instead, he found war. Sci-Fi fringe systems had ignited. A coalition of exiled Valari warlords, once allies of the old king, were making their move. Ships were moving, a blockade forming. There was talk of fracture, rebellion, a purge. They hadn't just accepted his rise, they'd waited for it. And now they meant to test it. Kale ran a hand through his hair, the flame crown still humming faintly on its display stand beside the console. "You going to deal with this without us?" came a groggy voice from behind him. The ceremony chamber pulsed with light and tension. Crystalline banners hung like frozen thunder above the crowd of assembled nobles, warriors, and foreign dignitaries, all gathered to witness something the Valari had never seen in the 1,000 cycles of their empire. A human, draped in ceremonial silver and obsidian, standing at the center of the grand spire with 3 alien women. Royal-born warriors once bound only to the throne, now bound to him. By ancient decree, yes, but the truth had long outgrown the law. Kyle stood tall, his earthborn features stark among the sea of alien beauty. The trio at his side, Talis, the strategist, cloaked in white fire, Nyari, the fighter, armored and radiant, and Viesa, the siren diplomat, shimmering with silken secrets, were no longer simply heirs to a throne. They were his wives by law, his allies by battle, and something far deeper by desire. They were his future, and the world was watching. "Kale of Earth," the High Seer intoned, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Do you accept the burden of the flame crown, to guide the Valari not as a stranger, but as blood-bound, bonded to our royal triad, by sacred flame and shared oath?" Kale's gaze slid to each of his wives. Talis met his eyes with a fierce, unflinching stare, one that had once sought to break him, now glowing with loyalty. Nyari smirked, half defiant even in reverence, daring him to say no. And Visa's smile was the slow curve of danger, seduction, and pride all in one. He looked forward, his voice steady. "I do." The flame crown descended. A halo of living crystal and fire formed from the molten core of Vela itself. As it settled onto Kale's head, the crowd erupted in a chorus of war cries, oath chants, an ululating song. But the pressure in Kale's chest wasn't from the ceremonial weight. It was from the fact that, with this act, he had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited a civilization steeped in old power, built on trial and violence. And now, they expected him, a human once mocked for his fragility, to lead not by mimicry, but by transformation. He was no longer an outsider. He was now the axis on which the empire would turn. Hours later, behind the privacy seals of the royal chambers, the real storm began to unfold. Kyle barely had time to remove the ceremonial gloves before Nyari shoved him backward onto the nearest velvet-lined seat with the same force she'd once used to pin him in the arena. "You accepted." "The crown," she growled, straddling him with slow, deliberate pressure. "Now we're going to see if you can wear it without falling apart." Her kiss was punishing, molten, but it wasn't anger. It was something else, something hungry, wild, and reverent. Tallis entered behind her, silent but sharp-eyed, already, undoing the laces of her own gown. "You've made us yours by law, Kyle, but now..." She slid closer, her fingers dragging across his exposed chest. "We make you ours." And Visa, trailing behind in a gown that shimmered like mist and shadows, simply smiled as she locked the chamber doors with a wave of her hand. "3 queens," she whispered. "1 king. And a night that none of us will forget." Kyle's breath caught as the 3 of them moved in concert. Nyari's heat, Tallis's precision, Vaesa's tease, all coordinated like a dance he'd only barely learned the steps to. "You realize," he managed, as Nyari kissed down his throat, "this probably isn't in the diplomatic manual." Visa laughed softly, curling herself around his side. "It will be, after tonight." Hours became moments. Moments became eternity. He didn't remember falling asleep, only the warmth of their bodies wrapped around his, their breathing slow and matched, their bond somehow deeper than skin, deeper than blood. When he awoke, the 3 of them were still wrapped around him, each in a different position, each in a different rhythm, but all with their energy synced to his own, and he felt it. Not just love, not just lust, but alignment. Valari tradition had brought them together, but something else had made them unbreakable. The morning came with fire in its belly, not from his wives, who lay still sleeping, their skin aglow with shared aftermath, but from the emergency transmission blinking red against the chamber wall. Kale disentangled himself with reluctant care and crossed to the console, expecting the usual post-coronation chaos. Instead, he found war. The fringe systems had ignited. A coalition of exiled Valari warlords, once allies of the old king, were making their move. Ships were moving, a blockade forming. There was talk of fracture, rebellion, a purge. They hadn't just accepted his rise. They'd waited for it, and now they meant to test it. Kale ran a hand through his hair, the flame crown still humming faintly on its display stand beside the console. "You going to deal with this without us?" came a groggy voice from behind him. Nyari sat up, hair tousled, eyes blazing. "No," Kyle said simply. "Not this time." The others stirred, and within moments, the chamber was alight with urgency. But there was no panic, just motion, focus, unity. "You're not just the flame, king now," Tallis reminded him as she fastened her armor with practiced ease. "You're the center of a new regime. They're not just testing your rule, they're testing ours." Visa, slipping into a midnight blue tactical gown, glanced toward him with that familiar mix of affection and razor-sharp insight. "It's not just a rebellion, Kyle. It's a message. They still think you're human first." Kyle stepped into his own gear. Lightweight, flexible, reinforced with Valari crystal threading, the same kind he'd once worn as a prisoner. Now, reforged into something worthy of a king. "Then it's time to show them what that means," he said. "And what does it mean?" Nyari asked, buckling her gauntlets. Kale looked at them. 3 women who had once mocked him, tested him, tried to break him, now bonded to him in ways law couldn't explain. "It means I don't have to be stronger," he said quietly. "I just have to be the one they can't predict," Visa smiled. "Then let's be unpredictable." As the newly crowned Flame King stepped into the war chamber flanked by his 3 queens, the assembled warlords, loyal and otherwise, stood to attention, their expressions a mixture of awe, resentment, and concealed calculation. Kale met them, all with a calm that had once been mocked. Now, it silenced the room. He stepped forward, and then he began to speak.